I want to go back to our earlier story, the top story tonight, in fact, the anniversary of the passing of late former President Nelson Mandela, who, by the way, considering the conflict in the Middle East at the moment, his stance on the war between the Israelis and the Palestinians has been well documented over the decades. At the moment, more than 15,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since Israeli bombardment began in October. The Israelis started firing on Gaza in response to an attack by the Palestinian armed group Hamas, which killed about 1,200 people on October 7th and took more than 200 hostages from Israel. Well, let's talk now about Madiba's legacy, especially in the fight for global justice. Bring in his grandson, Chief Mandla Mandela. A very good evening to you, sir. Thank you so much for your time and being with us on News at Prime. I wonder how you are reflecting on the life of your grandfather and his legacy 10 years on from his passing.
Well, thank you and good evening to you and your newsroom viewers. We as the family and the Royal House of Mandela wanted to utilize this 10th year anniversary to ensure that we champion the causes that Madiba stood for and he represented. And as you are well aware that one of those issues that was very close and dear to his heart was the Palestinian struggle. As he says that the Palestinian struggle is the greatest moral issue of our time. We decided in working with our partners, the Global Campaign to Return to Palestine, which I'm an ambassador for, a Lebanese-based NGO for Palestinians. We staged a 5th global convention for solidarity with Palestinians, and have been able to bring over 150 Palestinians in the diaspora from 72 countries into South Africa, where we have had a convention over the past 3 days, starting on the 3rd and 4th here in Johannesburg, listening to the Palestinians' leadership of the resistance and various NGOs that work with children, with women and political prisoners, about the experiences that they've had, not only since the 7th of October 2023, but since the day of the Nakba, the catastrophe which started 75 years ago, which the Palestinians continue to experience on a daily basis. And from having listened to them, we had numerous South African NGOs and solidarity movements that participated, with political parties coming to share their own experience about the brutal apartheid regime here in South Africa and how we were able to effectively wage a struggle for liberation and were able to collapse the apartheid regime in South Africa. You would know that the Palestinians hold South Africa to high regard, and this has been a conference that has added value to them. That concluded today with us going to put wreaths at the statue at the Union buildings.
Right. And one of the first, if you will, international priorities or engagements that the late former President Nelson Mandela had upon his release from prison by the apartheid government is where he stood side by side. He appeared publicly with the leader of the Palestinian people at the time, the late Yasser Arafat. Now, as things stand, the cause of the Palestinians 30 years on remains the same. Little has changed, if things have in fact not got worse on the ground for people in Gaza and the occupied territories. How do we go from the engagements that you are having and, let's say, what your grandfather had set out as the way forward as far as the link between South African suffering and the suffering of the Palestinians, and turn that into actual progress for the betterment of the lives of Palestinians who are still under occupation?
Well, you should really come from the premise that Madiba always used to say to us that Palestinians inspired them from prison during our darkest days in our struggle for liberation. It was Palestinians, Libyans, and Cubans that supported our cause to the heat. They not only supported us in words, but they put resources and supported us in arms to effectively wage an armed struggle and ensure that we were able to collapse the apartheid regime in South Africa. And this is why it was necessary for him in 1995, when he visited Gaza, to state that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. And therefore, we as South Africans have a duty to ensure that we continue to be that voice of a moral ground, where we ensure that we raise our voice wherever apartheid raises its ugly head. In this regard, you have witnessed many activities on the ground, putting in the work, ensuring that we engage with NGOs and CBOs on the ground. We have been speaking directly with religious and faith-based organizations, including unions and worker formations, which has culminated into political parties coming to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people, both from the majority party as well as from the opposition party. You would have seen recently that in Parliament, political parties decided to put a motion led by the EFF and supported by the ANC, as well as NFP, Al-Jamaa and PAC, and calling for South Africa to cut ties with apartheid state of Israel, as well as expelling the Zionist apartheid state of Israel's ambassador out of South Africa. This has been a collective victory for many South Africans that have stood in solidarity with the Palestinians. And we mustn't be deterred about what is happening in occupied Palestine and in Gaza in particular, because we understand very well from our own struggle for liberation that struggle for liberation is waged on many fronts, through an armed struggle, through boycott, divestments and sanctions, through international mobilization, where we are able to have created in our own experience a big anti-apartheid campaign, as well as a free Mandela campaign.
There's a problem with that, though, sir, is there not? Because as things stand, even though Parliament voted for the expulsion of the ambassador, the severing of diplomatic relations, if you will, with the Israelis, there's still no cabinet decision saying, in fact, let's go ahead as a country with the severing of those ties. There is still a trade relationship that persists between South Africa and Israel. So is Pretoria walking the talk on this?
Well, we must also understand that there are clear separation of powers between the executive, legislators, as well as the judiciary. But here, activists will continue to put in the efforts in mobilizing society to exert pressure on our government. And this is why we have clearly stated that to our President, His Excellency President Ramaphosa, that we did not ask for a consultation process to be held here in South Africa with those officials that are deployed in Tel Aviv. We have called for that office to be closed down and cutting ties with the apartheid state of Israel. We have not called for the ambassador of the apartheid state of Israel to be called for a consultation process in his occupied area of Palestine. We have called for him to be expelled. But there are clear issues that our government needs to look into that are within their own mandate. One is to actually, first and foremost, look at the flight operating permits that they are affording El Al, which is a national air carrier of the apartheid state of Israel. They, through the Department of Transport, if they truly are committed and are in solidarity with the Palestinians, should be able to revoke that. We have also said to the Ministry of Defense, through the Foreign Military Assistance Act, the 49 South Africans that we have been able to identify and present to them should be prosecuted and held accountable. We have also highlighted to the Minister of Basic Education, Jimotega, that a school in Cape Town, Heltzia, has publicly pronounced that 20% of its graduates go and serve in the IDF. These are issues that if our government needs to speak in solidarity with Palestinians, shouldn't be just in words. They should be illustrating that. And activists on the ground will continue to mobilize and exerting pressure until we attain that.
Let me get your thoughts then on the conflation, some say deliberate conflation, of support for Palestinian people, the many innocent in Gaza, a population of over 2 million, where over 15,000 have been killed, over 1.8 million, some are saying, have been displaced since fresh fighting broke out on October 7th. The conflation between support for them and support for Hamas, because whenever people like yourself come onto public platforms, often the accusation is that you are supporting Hamas and excusing attacks on the Israelis.
Well, let us be clear. Ours, as South Africans, it is an experience that we've had to undergo. 350 years of colonialism in South Africa, coupled with 60 years of a brutal apartheid regime. So when we say we fully understand what the Palestinians are experiencing, we are not siding with one faction of the Palestinians. We are speaking with Palestinians in totality. And this is why in this convention that we invited Palestinians right throughout the diaspora. So it hasn't been that it is only liberation forces that came to attend the conference, but Palestinians from 72 different countries. And this illustrates our position as South Africa, that we will continue to be vocal as far as we are fully aware of the atrocities that have been meted out on a daily basis since the Nakba 75 years ago, and it continues unabated till this day. And we can come to looking at what international law calls for. There's been over 30 UN resolutions that have been violated by the Zionist apartheid state of Israel. And you should also come to an understanding, just as we were able to have a right to resist occupation, Palestinians do also have a right in international law to resist occupation and resist secular colonialists.
Is what Hamas did on October 7th part of that resistance, given that in those attacks, even civilians, hundreds of them, were killed and taken hostage?
We must instantly denounce any violence that is exerted on civilians. And we have spoken out against that. And we will continue to call for the protection of children, women, and elderly civilians in particular. So on both sides, whether be from the resistance forces or from the apartheid state of Israel, we will continue to call for international law to be adhered to.
Chief Mandla Mandela, good to speak to you tonight, on the 10th anniversary of Nelson Mandela, your grandfather's passing. We're grateful for your time. Thank you.